Welcome to The Big Picture. I'm Phil Arno. We're pretty lucky here in Western New York. We don't have a lot to worry about. Not hurricanes or earthquakes. Normally we don't get a lot of tornadoes. Mother Nature slaps us around a little bit with an occasional blizzard or windstorm. But overall, other than politics, we really don't have too many complaints. But just when you think you can breathe easy, a coronavirus rears its ugly head. Now, we're pretty self-reliant around here, but sometimes when things like this happen, you gotta put a plan of action together just to get by. And my guest on this big picture is just the man who has the plan. Danny Neaverth Jr., who is Emergency Services Coordinator for Erie County. Let's talk a little bit about the emergency services for Erie County and how that's kind of kicked in. I mean, you've been training, you've been in charge of emergency services for Erie County for some time now. Did you ever imagine something like this and how quickly it came about?
You know, it's interesting, Phil, when we do exercises, we always do exercises to the extreme. And oftentimes, because we're doing them to the extreme, that artificiality that has to be built in, so whether it happens to be our pandemic planning or it happens to be our mass evacuation planning or surge capacity planning with the hospitals, a lot of times you'll have people that are at those tabletop exercises or those full-scale exercises, and they'll just kind of stand around and say, well, that'll never happen. That's nonsense. That we would never be overwhelmed like that. So it's critical to overcome that mindset to begin with. So we've done this. We've practiced this. These drive-through clinics that you see our health department and staff from emergency services and staff from Department of Public Works, from Erie County's Department of Public Works, working in conjunction with Amherst and Lancaster and Orchard Park. Those things didn't just happen because we had COVID-19. We've worked on those and pioneered those drive-through clinics for years now, more than a decade. And the nursing staff and the epidemiological staff and the public health preparedness staff, emergency services, you know, how do we fine tune that? So we've had these live drills where people have driven through, and we've had drive-through flu shot clinics where we've worked with the hospital emergency managers on that. They gather and talk once a month with regards to these for stockpiling of supplies. So there is a lot of things that have gone into this and planning for this and positioned, even though it's not ideal, it positioned us as a county, as towns, villages, as one Erie County, to be able to at least initially respond to this appropriately.
You know, I guess you listen to the news, and so many times you hear somebody say, I didn't think it could happen here, or, you know, it always happens to somebody else, but we never expected this kind of thing to happen to us. And I guess that's what you were explaining earlier is, like, you know, you prepare for these things, but in the back of your mind, you never really think that something like this is going to really happen. You got to be prepared for it, but wow, you know, it's actually here. Emergency services has kicked in. Under what conditions are you guys activated? Is it Mark Poloncarz has to make a declaration? Does it get to a certain level? Explain that process. How do you actually get your services kicked into gear and action?
So it's not something that is, you know, housed and is only rolled out when we have these type of emergencies. So pretty much most of my staff they're first responders. They leave after an 8-hour shift and go and contribute to their local volunteer fire company or EMS corps. So so we're in a constant state of readiness. When we do disaster preparedness here in Erie County, we do an all hazards approach. So we don't just focus necessarily on the bang or the flash. It's something as insidious as biological, as COVID-19, or it could be something civil unrest. So there's kind of a full cadre of different things that we do. So when this happened, or if we get a major snowstorm that's rolling through, or earlier this week, in addition to COVID-19, We were also getting staff with a split focus on the high winds that we really thought was going to be impactful in the county itself, and massive power outages and cooler temperatures. There's also the component that had to be ramped up with regards to sheltering. So you have a considerable homeless population here in Western New York. Traditionally, there are places for them to go, but now you compound the social distancing. So we actually had to multiply several times over the ability to be able to shelter those folks, so that we could maintain that social distancing just the same as you or I, and we have homes to go to, but how do we maintain that social distancing? So it's not a matter of activation. A lot of times what happens in disasters, first responders are already well engaged in the fight. And then the declarations, states of emergency, and all of the other things tend to follow. So it's not something where we reach a threshold, but traditionally disasters are described by your inability to be able to respond to with the appropriate resources. So once you max out on resources, whether it happens to be, in this particular case, the ability for capacity in hospitals or mortuary services or capacity for the homeless, once you exceed your existing capacity, that becomes an emergency. And it's not always something that's on fire. It's not always something that explodes. It in this particular case happened to be something that you couldn't see, that you couldn't define, and you couldn't cure. So what we're doing is we're working through all of the different aspects of that in emergency services. And probably one of the most interesting aspects of this is the non-traditional first responders that have had to adapt and adjust to a first responder mentality, that have kind of been on the fringes of this in the past. I'm talking about the grocery store workers who are true heroes out there. If we don't feed people, we compound the problem, and that leads to a whole trickle down of potential major issues. The hospital workers that work in an environment where you will put this procedure mask on, and then you will follow this process, and you will. But now you take out of that element some of those necessary supplies or those stockpiles of supplies because you can't find them anywhere in the country, let alone in the world. Now we have to adapt and adjust, and how do we do that? How do we modify that? So getting clinicians out of that clinical thinking into more of the EMS, and the example that I use, that first responder mentality of, we would all like to think that we have a nice vacuum splint that if you have a fracture you could put on a person. But when you get to mass casualties in the field, you don't have that luxury. There aren't hundreds of those. So what do? We take a piece of cardboard and we fashion a splint utilizing cardboard, getting people that are used to X, Y, Z into throw that out. We're throwing the rule book out here. You have to reinvent yourself. That was, I think, one of the most interesting aspects so far with regards to this, breaking people out of their little comfort zone and saying, imagine whatever it is we have to do, and then we'll make it happen.
Yeah, that was going to be one of my questions is did you have to change gears at all to what you had trained for and adapt? And I think you've answered that. You have to really be flexible in terms of what you've prepared for and how you handle every particular situation, because you really can't predict exactly what's going to happen. An emergency is an emergency, but it can take any kind of form, and you just have to be prepared for it and be able to make it up as you go, basically, to deal with whatever's coming. Now, another question would be, you're in the midst of this particular emergency, this virus that's got everybody locked down and has kind of thrown everyday life into a lockdown, if you will. What happens if another major emergency comes? How are we prepared in Erie County? How much can we deal with before you become overtaxed with your resources and need outside help? How do we get to that point, and what do you do if something else comes up?
Well, I think we could probably use as an example the wind event, the potential for 70+ mile an hour wind gusts. And I can tell you, if you focus on the way the utilities do things, the utilities find a region that's not going to be impacted by the storm, and they utilize those. They move additional crews in from Ohio and from other areas. So we're very resourceful here. And the traditional mutual aids that might take place. Whereas if we're having an issue here, we would maybe look downstate for some of those. Or if we had a statewide issue here, we would look to other states or across the country. Superstorm Sandy was an example of that, where crews were flown in from around the country to assist with mitigating that. This is everywhere. This is the entire country. So we don't have that luxury. We don't have the luxury of calling our partners over in Southern Ontario and saying, hey, by the way, can you help us here? This is a worldwide event. So the help that you need is, if you look to your left, you look to your right, and then you start knocking on doors maybe that you've never knocked on before. So it's just-in-time training. It's non-traditional first responders who are now traditional first responders. And if there has to be, if we have to ramp things up, how do we get Phil and the staff at WBBZ trained to be able to assist us? And so you have to roll with the punches. You have to have a plan to be able to deliver those punches. But it's really that's getting back to that whole all-hazard approach when no one's coming. Even during major disasters, when we have the federal government that's going to be sending help in from FEMA, or during a major event, the state will be sending resources. The timelines there are state roughly 12 hours or more before we get that assistance. The feds, 72 hours. They've never backed away from that timeline with regards to the time to deliver it. So your community, your town, your village, your city, your county has to be able to come up with a plan to get you through at least the first 12 hours, maybe even the 72 hours. Or, as has been the case with COVID-19, you're going to have to come up with creative ways of getting through it just as your own community. And I think because of the fact that, and I'll tell you, when I bring this up during, pre-winter press conferences and whatnot, I get kind of like this look from reporters and from others when I say, it's not what we're doing today, it's what we've been doing the 364 days leading up to today. And that's reaching out to all of your partners, not caring if it's a town or a village or a state, not necessarily caring who's making the decision or who's in charge. It's who's in charge of what. How do you pull all those things together? How have you communicated with your hospitals before COVID-19? Have you worked with your emergency managers? Have you worked with your leading grocery stores, Wegmans and Tops, and had those discussions on how can you help us and how can we help you? The answer in Erie County, at least, is yes to all of those, and that's why we can move through a lot of these things as easily as I don't want to say easily, but we certainly have moved through efficiently. And then afterwards, we'll take a look and we'll see what can we do better.